how relaxing to hear the soothing sounds of the rainforest, the rain coming down. That's $18,000 a month potentially of revenue to somebody who started a podcast using white noise sound effects and is getting a payout for everybody that listens to it. Sometimes we make the work a little harder on ourselves than we need to. That's one of our top stories that we're going to talk about today on this episode of the Media Roundtable. Welcome. This is our industry edition where we dive deep into events and topics around the business of audio through the lens of the brands and buyers who support it, or as we like to call them, chief audio officers. I'm your host, Dan Granger, CEO and founder of Oxford Road, and I have a wonderful team that I'm surrounded by with today. We have our fellow agents of influence, Neal Lucey, head of strategy and insights at Oxford Road. Welcome, Neal.
Hello, hello.
And we have Kristen Duenas, associate media director at Oxford Road. Welcome back, Kristen.
I'm back. Let's go.
And most importantly, I think we can all agree is that we have the great James Cridland joining us again. James is fresh off of the plane or the boat or the something where he was just covering Podcast Day Asia in person. Welcome, James.
Greetings. It's good to be here. Sorry if I'm sounding a bit tired.
I can't imagine why. So yeah. You are truly the roving reporter of the industry, flying from continent to cover all these things. What can you tell us from your time in Asia? What was that all about?
Oh, it was really good. So it was a whole day talking about podcasting in Asia, everywhere from India over to Japan, down to Singapore and various other places as well. I think, I left there thinking that, there is so much opportunity in that part of the world. I hosted I hosted the entire day, but I hosted a monetization panel with Acast and MiaVox Live and Audacia. And one of the things I learned is that Spotify really isn't monetizing podcasts in that region at all. Spotify is big in some countries, but actually there's a lot of local apps and things in every single country. And the highlight for me was downloading a bunch of podcasts to listen to in the plane on the way home, and not one of them had any programmatic ads in it. So clearly not very many people are selling into Malaysia right now.
Does that mean there were baked in, stitched in live integrations, or does that mean they didn't have any ads?
Yeah, well, they didn't have any ads that had been sold to people who lived in Malaysia. So these were, big, US and Australian shows, but clearly nobody had bought any ads targeted to that part of the world. So I've learned a new way of finding ad-free podcasts. That's clearly the way.
Was there? I'm curious because we've been looking at international markets for some of our client base, and Asia is one of those markets. So Asia Pacific, so Australia and New Zealand are pretty obvious. India seems like an interesting market. Curiously, Japan, like across the board for audio, pretty much anything seems below average.
Yes.
Are there any insights in terms of maybe markets in Asia that we wouldn't necessarily think of straight away for podcasts that we might want to consider?
Yeah, I mean, the Philippines particularly is really growing. Of course, an English-speaking language, an English-speaking country, certainly. So that's certainly worthwhile keeping an eye on. But I think just the amount of growth and the amount of beginning of understanding of what you can do with shows, what you can do with advertising in those parts of the world was really interesting. But obviously you have the more developed markets like Australia, New Zealand, Singapore as well. It seems to be doing, really well. But I think, there's just so much opportunity for growth in the region. I think, one of my personal highlights, I have a writer based in Singapore who came to the conference and shared with us his research into podcasting across Asia. And as you say, Japan has never been a very strong audio market. But certainly when you're having a look at other parts of the place. Absolutely, there's some real interest in audio and audio advertising through through all kinds of means. So yeah, that was really interesting.
So there's a number of stories we need to cover here with you, James, but before we move on, could you just give us some relativity in terms of size of consumption and size of revenue when you contrast Asia with something we're more familiar with, like North America?
I mean, really everywhere outside of the US is what I guess I would call underperforming in terms of revenue. But when you're having a look at certain Asian countries, again, the Philippines, which is really Spotify's market, has an awful lot of Spotify users there. That seems to be doing fantastically well. But in different countries, different people call podcasts different things. So different people are assuming that podcasts have video on them. Different people are assuming, or different countries are assuming that podcasts are specific formats. So I think that all of that was interesting to end up seeing. I think the big highlight of the day actually was a former politician called KJ, former politician who lost his seat in the last election, has now moved to being a radio DJ. So he's part of the Hot FM breakfast crew, but also has a very successful podcast. And what he's doing, I think quite cleverly, is he's realizing he needs to be really personable, really approachable. He needs to be the person that people recognize on the street. And who knows, he might be Malaysia's next prime minister.
Yeah, exactly.
It
seems
doing
to
it.
be part of the path now.
Doing it in a really, really interesting way. And it was very difficult to get him from the hotel lobby into the room that we were having the conference, because everybody wanted to stop him, tell him how much they really enjoyed what he was doing, and take selfies. So that was really hard. So yeah, that was fun.
Your social media footprint is now a big part of your credentializing for high office, as it turns out now. So
no, for him, yeah, absolutely, and such a difference to other folks in politics. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that was fascinating to see.
Okay, well, we could go further on that, but let's get back to the story we started with. It's just a little interest story where it's kind of like, wait a minute, I didn't know you could make that much money doing that. How come I didn't think of it? Kristen, will you give us some background on the white noise? I won't call it gate, but
white noise gate works. I think it works.
The business opportunity of white noise.
I mean, it's a massive missed opportunity for me. I mean, thinking about like making $18,000 a month just by making shushing noises or rattling teeth in a jar. It's kind of strange. With Spotify, it's really important to understand what their ambassador ads program is. So essentially, it's cross promotion within their own scope of shows that they carry. So they're paying these podcasters to read ads for Spotify owned shows. And that's how they were able to pay supposedly $18,000 per month for some of these podcasters in the white noise space. However, white noise, it turns out, is a really lean back genre. So people are listening to white noise and it's just this background noise, kind of like how you might listen to a music station while you're working. It's not something that you're actively listening to. And where podcasts have always worked for us is people are leaning in, right? That's where like that news talk format in radio or the talk format in podcast really works, is people are actively engaged in listening, and that's why the ads work better. So what they were seeing here is they're spending $38 million a month, or I'm sorry, annually on these ads, and they're not converting into people going to these other podcasts. So it's a waste of money because people are genuinely not paying attention. So I hope everybody enjoyed the gravy train, but it's leaving the station.
So wait a second. Like I thought, so this is actually Spotify paying these podcasters to promote their other podcasts. So
correct. So it's part of their marketing.
Yeah, while I'm listening to Rain trying to go to sleep, and I'm interrupted with an ad for Joe Rogan in podcast. That's what we're talking about.
That's what we're talking about. Yeah.
I played this one particular podcast that we just played the sample of on iTunes. And what I heard was a message, a promotional message telling people about how they can make money by easily starting their own podcast with Spotify.
You realize what this is?
Yeah.
It's an LLM.
So maybe because of this story, everybody wanted to figure out how to get on the gravy train, and maybe they are using that strategically to say, oh, are you trying to show up trying to figure out how to make this white noise money? And then telling them, well, go ahead and start on the platform, which not a bad idea. I don't know, James, what's your take on all this?
Yeah, I don't know necessarily that individual shows are earning $18,000 out of it, but certainly Spotify have made a couple of changes. One of those changes is that the types of content eligible for the Ambassador Ads program are being changed, and specifically white noise podcasts will not be included in that. And they've also changed the number of listeners that you need in order to actually start monetizing with that. And they've made it significantly harder. It used to be 100 unique Spotify listeners within the past 60 days. They've now made that 1,000. So they've made it 10 times harder. Well, actually even more so. But I find it interesting that Acast, never knowingly missing an opportunity, ended up releasing some data a couple of weeks ago talking about the amount of podcast listeners who fall asleep listening to shows. 48% of podcast listeners have used a podcast to help them fall asleep. 3/4 have used a podcast for relaxation. And surprise, surprise, they do tell us that more than half of podcast listeners remembered an ad the next day. And more than 1/3 made a purchase after hearing an ad while falling asleep. So even if you are consuming podcasts in a dark, relaxing setting, people do still remember, the Geico insurance ad, and the very next morning rush to renew their motorbike insurance or whatever it is that they actually have. So I thought, interesting seeing that, but clearly an awful lot of people do use shows to fall asleep, and there is a real opportunity there.
Well, as a buyer, when you just said that, the first thing I thought was, oh man, I hope we're not running ads when people are sleeping, because that would that's a brand new type of ad fraud I had not considered. On the other hand, the fact that we get to get into people's subconscious mind now and reprogram while they're sleeping, that might be the best ad inventory in the universe. I think we need to do some A/B testing on this.
It's podcast inception.
Yeah.
We're both podcast is both a lean in medium and a lean really, really, really back medium. Yeah.
Very nice. Acast also, by the way, say that 1/3 of people who listen to podcasts to fall asleep take more than 30 minutes. So actually, if you're looking for opportunities to hear, if you're looking for a large amount of opportunity to actually get that message over, it seems like the perfect place to be advertising.
All right, so tell me if you've ever heard of any of these companies. Indeed, Shopify, NetSuite, Headspace, Quip, Theragun, Postmates. I'm not only the host of the Media Roundtable, but also CEO of a company called Oxford Road, and we are the world's leading independently owned and operated audio ad agency. And what that means is that we help great companies, many that you have probably heard of on some of the other podcasts that you listen to. We help them test and scale campaigns in audio channels, with podcast being one of those leading channels. Some of the work that we do includes media planning and buying, as well as analytics, attribution, and insights. And we also have a very special way that we deal with creative and copy generation. We have our own proprietary process called Audiolytics that allows us to score ads for their persuasiveness. If you're looking to be involved in audio and you want a partner that can help work with you to make sure that you achieve unprecedented ROI and massive scale, you should get in touch with us at Oxford Road. And by the way, The only reason that we're able to do the work of the Media Roundtable is because we have a great team at Oxford Road that supports us and makes it possible. So, what we're doing is not just a podcast, but we're really trying to help brands live out their values and balance that with their business objectives, which is an increasingly hard thing to do in this world of misinformation and malice that's infecting so much of our media. But at Oxford Road, we don't want to just broker this stuff. We want to impact the industry for good. We want to raise the bar on what gets created. And Oxford Road is helping make that possible through the Media Roundtable. So if you're somebody that's interested in working with an ad agency or a partner on this type of work for your advertising campaigns, go to oxfordroad.com. It's easy to spell. And get in touch with us, or at least just sign up for our free newsletter, The Influencer. That's Oxford Road. Well, who knew? New genre to start paying attention to. We'll have to start exploring that as a case study for performance marketing. So, all right, James, there's another report that just came out by Nielsen. Do you mind giving us a little context on this, and we can unpack if there's anything there for brands?
Yeah, so Nielsen release a Podcasting Today report that comes out very, very regularly. Lots of data in there. Some of the data through Edison Research, some of the data through the Scarborough numbers as well. Neal, what did you see in that data that you thought was interesting?
Yeah, I think, and we're going to talk about two research studies, the other one from YouGov. So both reputable organizations, obviously. The Nielsen report I thought was interesting, mainly because it dove a little bit deeper into audience segments. So listenership between like 18 to 24, 25 to 34, different age segments, and showed that listenership is increasing pretty much for all age segments. The other two things, the first thing was we don't get a ton of insight into listenership among diverse audiences. So it was nice to see the growth in listenership, especially among the Hispanic and Asian consumers in recent years. So that was good data to have, because we get questions about that. So I think that was additive from the study. And then the last, and part of it is like, do we need another piece of research to say that podcast advertising is effective? But they delved into their database, and we have yet another. So if you're out there wondering, do podcast ads work for upper funnel or lower funnel? Nielsen says yes, and so it's just another piece of data, even though I don't think we really need another piece of data to show that podcast ads work.
And for everyone who's listening, I think my biggest thing as far as like the racial breakouts was Hispanic audience having grown 95% over the last 5 years. That's huge growth. And that's definitely an underserved market. So that's something that I would definitely want to look into as a marketer.
Well, and I guess 95% is a nice number, but I don't know what concentration looked like in the prior period. So,
Fair.
If you went from if that particular group were to say represent 8% of the population, I don't know what the actual number is, but we only had 0.2%, and so it jumped to 0.4. It could mean very different things. When we started in the business 10 years ago, when we opened the agency, it was young men, early adopters, geeks and gamers of a certain age. It was like 18 to 34, maybe 25, 44 men. And that was pretty much it. And then I think we saw, particularly during COVID, like that's where we kind of rung the bell to figure out how many podcasts can you actually stuff into the system and where does it start to break down. But what I noticed is the shows that were being created started to really reflect different groups and demographics. but I don't know if the audience ever really caught up with that. And so I'm really curious to know, okay, yes, we see some of these shifts happening. How close are we to actually mirroring the general population? Because if we look at these numbers in the absence of that, I don't think the full story is there.
I mean, your words to Nielsen's ears. And
then James, I think you had a thought for Nielsen about time spent listening, or a question?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of data in here. There's lots of data of heavy podcast listeners versus light podcast listeners, all of that information. The one thing that I wish that we would get from this data is just how long are Americans listening to podcasts? And we still don't get those figures. We've got some sort of, very complicated figures of, 42% listen to between 1 and 4 hours during a particular month, and so on and so forth. But I would just like to see a total hours number, because that's the number that's important to advertisers. That's also the number that's important to podcast networks as well. So please, could we have that simple, straightforward number? Thank you.
Here. And then there's another report that came out. Neal's particularly excited about it because he loves the name.
Oh,
it
yes,
was
I love
Podheads report that talks about the difference between the podcast listener profile and the radio listener profile. So, Neal, any shocks there, and why are you so excited about Podheads?
Oh, I just love the name. It just really paints podcast listeners in such a great light, I think. So these are people that listen to 5 hours or more per week. So they are listening to a lot of podcasts. They're younger, more likely even to be male. Maybe that's why they called them podheads. I don't know. But I think what stuck out to me, I mean, I don't think much surprised me about who the listener is, where they listen. I mean, I think a lot of this is information we've seen before. What I thought was interesting about the study was that it looked into like 15 or 16 different categories, maybe even slightly more than that. And it looked at consideration for brands among the podheads versus the general population, and showed, I mean, for the most part, there was some instances where it wasn't always true, much higher consideration for the brands among the heavy podcast listeners. So this is auto brands, this is alcohol brands, this is fintech brands, this is retail brands. So I to me, is if you're a brand and compete in one of those categories, then there's a lot of categories there, it's worth taking a look at. If your competitor's there and you're not, and you see these higher consideration numbers, that's something to consider. Or if you're listed in this report and you're not currently advertising a podcast, well, there's a really good opportunity for you to reach an audience that is ready to buy, potentially.
Yeah, there's two ways to read it, right? You can look at it and go, oh, this brand ranks high, and so therefore they ought to be there nurturing that audience. On the other hand, it's like, if you're not on the list, are you really the one that needs to be there? It does seem like my big takeaway looking at this report is that podcast listeners really like Chipotle. And I didn't understand that, but the index there was through the roof. Any theories?
Oh man, there it is. That's the correlation to potheads, is the love of Chipotle.
Love of Chipotle.
Maybe the young male target.
Yeah, I don't know.
But it was but like wine brands, I saw Kim Crawford was listed with much higher consideration among the podhead audience versus the general population. So there's a lot of variety in the brands.
I just wish we knew why. Right. Yeah. I wish we knew why it pulled in those directions. But okay. I mean, look, it's always hard. And James, I'm sure you struggle with this every day of your life, which is like, okay, there's another study that says something about how listenership is growing, do you even talk about it at a certain point? Because we don't want it the punchline of every news story to be, and therefore you should be participating in podcasts, right? But this one was somewhat illuminating, I think. Did you find anything else here that was noteworthy?
Yeah, I mean, I liked some of the language that YouGov used. They call podheads an unskippable audience. See what they did there, So I think that there's some quite interesting stuff just in terms of the language that they end up using. Look, I think with as with all of these, there might be a gem that you can take to a specific client. In all of these pieces of research that actually tick their box and make them, turn from being somebody that is considering buying advertising on a podcast to actually buying it. So from that point of view, I always think that new studies are useful. I'm such a not particularly a fan of people who shorten the word podcast to pod. Says the man that runs a website called Podnews. But nevertheless, not such a fan of this. But even so, I did find it amusing though. Their release starts even as the podcast ears race begins to cool. Podcast listenership continues to grow, and I think this whole narrative that podcasting is cooling down is something that I find very strange, and I think it's just being driven by changes in the way that Spotify have been doing their particular work. And I'm kind of there thinking, we should probably be trying to stamp out any conversation going on around podcasting cooling down, because it most certainly isn't.
Yeah, I think what gets lost in translation there is, like you said, the deals that were unruly are cooling down. We're starting to get back to is there cause to give somebody a multi-$100 million contract or valuation when you're using sane economic principles and formulas for this stuff. But I think what it ends up sounding like is, oh, we're no longer doing a bunch of new Joe Rogan deals, and therefore the industry may be slowing down, when I think we all know that it's not.
And it's not just the new big, heavy, expensive shows that's slowing down, though. It's also net new shows, period. I think there's more podcast adoption across the board, but total new shows in general is really what's taken a backseat.
Yeah, I think the other thing to me is, podcasts, like the audience growth has been rapid, right? So we've seen like a big increase in listenership of podcasts. Of course, after you get to a certain point, you're not going to grow as you're not going to see 20% growth in listenership or 10%. It's going to be 5%, 4%, single digits. It's just a matter of, like any medium, as it gets more penetration, it's not going to grow as quickly. But I think the other thing is, but the time spent listening is obviously still growing. So to say that it's cooling down, I think it's a misrepresentation of the marketplace.
I'd like to interview the person who's out there saying, we need more podcasts. Please, someone make more podcasts.
Yeah. 4 million plus podcasts. 4 million isn't enough.
I said 5. I think we're at 5.
Need more.
Yeah, so you're right. There's a lot getting lost in translation here, and I think we've all aligned on the idea that time spent listening is really tells the tale of the industry, and that's doing just fine, moving in the right direction. There's still a lot of share that podcast is going to continue to take in the U.S. as well as internationally from other channels. So, by the way, speaking of podheads, there's a bit of news that just came out. If you pay attention to the cannabis industry, also a boom industry, and while not federally legal, is something that can be purchased legally for recreational use in many states now. Well, we know this because they call us constantly. We've really kind of stayed out of the THC business, but they've all been trying to get into audio. And a lot of groups have not been willing to accept the business, including Spotify. Well, as it turns out, according to High Times, Chicago-based marijuana company Cresco Labs Inc. Is allegedly going to be the first cannabis company to launch on Spotify. So I think that says something about the industry and the growth of that industry. Neal, what's your take on this?
I think, I mean, just set aside any preconceived notions about marijuana usage and think about what streaming audio offers to advertisers. So a younger audience, music listening, the ability to geo-target, all factors that would make sense for a cannabis company, right? So I think I assume some people, use cannabis when listening to music, enjoy music. So there's that contextual alignment. And I think it's a lesson for other advertisers that there are like the audience that you're going after, the ability to geo-target them, that can be done efficiently in streaming audio. So I think that's my hot take on it. And I think the other part of it is the federal government is relaxing kind of standards around, who can accept cannabis advertising. So I think that's happening too.
Yeah, I mean, I don't cover cannabis at all in any of the work that I do, primarily because I would like people to actually get my emails and for those emails not to be blocked. So that's a thing. But I think there are parallels. I've coming back from Kuala Lumpur, which is a Muslim country, walking through the shopping mall, lots of advertising for alcohol, and lots of small print on the bottom of the alcohol advertising, saying 18 plus non-Muslim only, on the bottom of there. And I think, again, there are real opportunities for being able to target your advertising, make sure that your advertising is not wasted, and certainly making sure that your advertising isn't being heard by people who, for whatever reason, don't want that particular thing that you're actually selling them. So I think, the fact that you can geo advertise cannabis or indeed alcohol, that you actually know whether somebody is a Muslim or not Muslim, in the particular case of Malaysia, means that your ad money goes far further, and you can also avoid any embarrassment in terms of culture as well. So I think this is a real opportunity that we have that many other media don't, and it's certainly something that we should be leaning into.
Okay, so to me, the real question is, how did Spotify make this decision? Because that they've had several thousand inquiries from this category. So how did they pick the one strain of marijuana that they were going to accept? Was it the size of the deal? Was it their distribution in legal markets? Or was it simply the quality of product? And somebody at Spotify was sampling everybody that came to them, and then they waited until the perfect opportunity came across, and this was just that good. Is that what happened? How do you think they came to this decision? That's what I want to know.
I think it's somewhat the loosening of federal restrictions. I mean, I think for a long time,
they just picked the first one that was in front of them.
Yeah, in California, marijuana dispensaries for a long time couldn't take credit cards. I think that's now, like, the federal government is allowing marijuana dispensaries to take credit cards now. So the restrictions are being loosened, and they'll continue to be loosened if, as more and more states kind of put these measures on the ballot, and if more and more states accept cannabis as a legal industry.
Well,
and of course, it is some great marketing from the company themselves, who say on their Twitter bio, who say on their website, we are on a mission to normalize and professionalize cannabis. And if that is their mission, then what better way of marketing that than saying that they've got a deal with Spotify to advertise on it?
Well, what'll be interesting is if in 6 months or a year, we look back at the categories that are driving the industry. And if this just opened the floodgates, it's going to be like crypto on television, right? It's going to be suddenly a brand new category has emerged and they're buying out the inventory. So it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting. All right, let's keep moving. A couple more things to cover here. One is that the network that carries this particular podcast, the Media Roundtable, Podcast One, on the strength of this program, of course, has gone public as of last week. They had their IPO. We're very excited for them. This is a big moment because for a number of reasons. To see a podcast, to see pod in a ticker is interesting. It's Pod C. But, you know, Podcast One really was one of the early entrants into the space. We've talked about this, that what Norm Pattis did, he is credited with basically inventing the radio syndication business. And then in a post, he took Westwood One public, went and started doing other things, and then saw the opportunity in podcast and really laid the foundation. And so to see them on the stock exchange, I think is a matter of pride for a lot of people that have been affiliated with that network for a while. I'd count us among that. And Norm Pattis, may he rest in peace. We lost at the end of last year in 2022. I think this is a bit of recognition of his dream realized. So want to congratulate Kit and the team at Podcast One today for this milestone. And any other thoughts from you guys on this one?
It's very exciting to see them all launch. Very exciting to see them ringing the bell as well. There's a video on the NASDAQ website of folks ringing the bell, and I'm there watching all of the people. I could see Jordan Harbinger in the background. I'm sure that there were other large podcasters there as well. So yeah, it must have been a very exciting morning for them last week.
Yeah, so big news for the industry, and bummer that our podcast couldn't be there on the floor when they rang the bell, but we're happy to see them cross the threshold. Another honorable mention, our friends at SiriusXM have started a new offering in partnership with Barometer, who we've talked about here, as well as ArtsAI. Kristen, you want to break this one down for us a little bit?
Yeah, so SiriusXM announced their first market verification solution for podcast advertising, essentially working with Barometer and ArtsAI by placing the ArtsAI pixel and being able to report on brand safety suitability in real time. I have questions, because anything that they would be reporting isn't necessarily going to be in real time. You have to figure that if a pixel is fired, then it's already post real time. So I don't understand how this would be getting ahead of any potential brand suitability issues. Whereas like we would use Barometer in advance by vetting different podcasts to make sure that it hits all of our brand suitability markers for our clients, just so that we know, hey, here's where things shake out like on an average overall, and we're not trying to catch up after the fact. So I would love to know, and I'm going to have conversations with our friends at SiriusXM on how this is expected to work, what that actually looks like, and is it really an innovation? Because if it's after the fact, it doesn't seem all that forward thinking.
Well, and I think we're all excited to see brand safety content ratings fed in with other types of data that we measure. But to your point, one of the things in the brand safety industry that the larger companies and agencies, I think, are desirous of is that ability to say, okay, after the show is recorded, we will or will not allow ads to be dynamically inserted before posted. In that small window between when they stop recording and they go to post, can you create at least rules or an approval process so that brands can see the contents and make decisions on an episode by episode basis? And what I hear you saying, Kristen, is that we don't know yet if or when that will be a factor. And so therefore, if the show's already posted, the ad's already in it, how much value does that have versus just evaluating the show on its face beforehand?
Correct. Because like even if it's dynamically inserted, you have to figure thousands of impressions can be served before it gets flagged by anybody, and then you pull the ad. So it stands to reason that if there is that window of error, then there potentially could still be issues. I mean, I want to believe that this is not that. I want to believe that there is a way to get ahead of it more quickly, but I think that's going to be, a larger conversation, and maybe we'll have to follow up and see what that actually looks like.
Yeah, we'll definitely keep watching it. Go ahead.
I guess from reading the release, they're talking about being able to, while your ad campaign is in motion, being able to pull individual shows, and if they've ended up saying something naughty. So I suppose it's real time in terms of you're not waiting until a campaign has finished for the post campaign analysis to go, oh, what were we doing advertising in there? So I suppose from that point of view, it's slightly more real time, but it's not, as you say, actually real time. It's not necessarily going to instantly pull you from, new shows that you shouldn't have been in the first place.
Well, so to spell out what you're saying, James, in practical terms, if I'm an advertiser and I want to figure out how to protect my brand from certain types of content, what this is a step towards being able to potentially pull back an ad that's been inserted into content that didn't pass your standards before it reaches its total audience impression load. However, you still won't know that until you've had some penetration. So it may be a step in the right direction for what a lot of brands are looking for, but we're not all the way there yet. And I think we can all agree it is early days in podcasts still. It is earlier days in brand safety and suitability for podcasts. So we are not at the end. We are not at the beginning of the end. We are probably coming into the end of the beginning. And with that, we are at the end of this particular episode. So I want to thank you guys for another vigorous episode of the Media Roundtable. This podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road, where we want you not just to succeed in audio, we want you to use your influence for good. And as members of the marketing community, we have the power to advance voices that don't just entertain, but also edify, and to build bridges across differences and preserve fair-minded discussion around the most important topics of our age. It's one of the things that we love about this medium. If you're a marketer looking to align your brand values with extraordinary business outcomes, please reach out to our agency, Oxford Road, by going to oxfordroad.com. Make sure you subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. It is free, and it is everything that a chief audio officer needs as part of a balanced diet. If you want to give us feedback, something we haven't asked you for a lot, we want feedback as a breakfast of champions. We want to know what you have to say. How can we serve you better with this program? Send us an email, info@mediaroundtable.com. We will all see and discuss what you have to say, whether we agree with it or not. Special thanks to Bianca, Kyle, Haley, the team at Podcast One, and James Cridland. Do not forget to subscribe to Podnews Daily or to the Podcast Business Journal. And as always, influence responsibly.